Alhamdulillahi wa kafa wa salamun ala ibadihi alladhina istafa. Amma ba'd, faqad qala Allahu azza wa jalla fil Qur'an al-Majid wal Furqan al-Hamid. Huwa alladhi arsala rasulahu bil huda wa din al-haq liyuzhirahu ala ad-din kullih walau kariha al-mushrikun. Sadaqa Allahu mawlana al-azim. وقال جل جلاله وعم نواله في شان حبيبه مخبرا وآمرا إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد معدن الجود والكرم وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم وصل عليه करूं तेरे नाम पे जान फिदा न बस एक दो जहां फिदा नहीं दो जहां से भी जी भरा करूं क्या करोड़ों जहां नहीं. My distinguished audience, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We gather here today to consider a very important issue of our time that arises out of a case that took place, or should I say a saga that took place many thousands of miles away from the shores of the United Kingdom, but it affects all Muslims in all parts of the world. This is not a Pakistani issue, this is an issue that affects all Muslims in all parts of the world. And it is very important for Muslims living outside to know the reality and the context of this saga, because of course recent events have punctured our confidence in the already perverted Pakistani media. We thought Pakistan as a country was generally an inherently corrupt country, but the recent blackout of the media goes to show the power of the state in usurping that very instrument that stands for civil liberties and above all for reality and the propagation of the truth. Since the advent of the Renaissance in Europe, the modern world has struggled with religion. And it would be safe to say that, without going into detail, that when one looks back at the age of struggle between Renaissance values which have been encapsulated in the methodology of secular thinking, when one looks at the strife between it and religion, it would be safe to say that secularism has prevailed throughout the world and continues to prevail. The reasons for its domination is a separate lecture for a separate day. It initially harbored its methodology in schemes of thinking such as communism, Marxism, Trotskyism, Stalinism, and then fascism. And then when history testified to the barbarism of these regimes, it now houses itself safely in so-called liberalistic values. Values which are supposed to be saviors for the modern world. Values which are supposed to promote universality of human rights which are universal and inalienable. But within the context of Western countries, there is a clear understanding as to the parameters of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. But when one deals with countries like Pakistan, which were specifically made in the name of religion and not for the promotion of secular values, there are serious definitions that need to be put into place as to what is and what is not acceptable. Of course, that again is a lecture for another day and another time. But today here we gather to reflect upon this saga that has taken place and culminated in the execution of an individual. An execution of an individual that is part of an ongoing saga for 5 years, and it is said in a very, I would say, irresponsible manner by the media, which of course has its own agenda, that this is simply a case of a killer who has been executed. It is not as simple as that. And today I would like to shed a little bit of light to show that there is far more to this story than that which meets the eye, or perhaps that which the arms of state would like you to know, or perhaps that which the media would like you to know. Let's look at Mumtaz Qadri himself. It is often said that this is a typical case of terrorism, and it's easy for states to simply dismiss something and send it into oblivion by labeling it as terroristic, because of course people subscribe to terrorism and the condemnation of terrorism very, very easily. So when something is labeled as being terrorist, well then that's the end of the argument. But this is not a case of terrorism. We do not support terrorism. No Muslim who understands a grain of the Quran and Sunnah can promote the terrorism that exists in the world today, whether in the name of Islam or whether in the name of any other religion. The terrorism mounted by ISIS, by Al-Qaeda, or by any other group in the name of Islam is obnoxious to Islam, has nothing to do with Islam, and as far as we are concerned, it is a new religion, and those people who are proponents of that religion are answerable to both people in this world and of course to their Lord in the hereafter. We are bari, we are exempt from their actions. The Quran and Sunnah condemn categorically such forms of terrorism. There are no forms of terrorism that we in any way, shape or form advocate. However, the case of Ghazi Mumtaz Hussain Shaheed rahimahumullah ta'ala is not a case of terrorism the way the Pakistani media or perhaps the Western media would like to label for its sheer convenience in mounting its secular thuggery over individuals to whom it does not share an agenda with. So let's start off by looking at Mumtaz Qadri and his reality. Firstly, he was not a known terrorist. He was not on any CIA, MI5, MI6 list. He was not on any Mossad list. He was not on any intelligence list. He was an ordinary citizen performing an ordinary job in his times as allocated by his paymaster. Had no affiliations to any terrorist organizations, whether that's Al-Qaeda or ISIS or any other organizations. For that matter, he was not part of any proscribed organizations. And I would like to put to strict proof all those who can bring any proof to show that he was part of any proscribed organization. In fact, he was till his last part of an organization known as Dawat-e-Islami. Dawat-e-Islami is headed by an individual called Maulana Ilyas Qadri. And this organization openly advocates the concept of no violence. It's a pacifist organization. It does not advocate any form of violence. Nor have there been any reported incidences of violence collectively by Dawat-e-Islami or individually by Dawat-e-Islami. It's condemned, any form of violence is condemned by Dawat-e-Islami. Dawat-e-Islami finds its roots in Sufi thinking. And so therefore, Shaheed Ghazi Mumtaz was part of this organization, and there was no concept of him subscribing to an organization that promoted any form of terrorism. Then if you look at the acts of the day itself, there were no hallmarks of terrorism in the actual incident that took place. It wasn't premeditated. He didn't set out with an elaborate plan to kill the governor. He didn't set out in a premeditated way, the way a terrorist, or for that matter even a murderer, would set out to conspire and pre-plan a murder. It was instantaneous, it was on the spot, and I will go into detail of the circumstances in a minute. Secondly, as with terrorism, it wasn't indiscriminate killing whereby there were collateral casualties. It doesn't matter how many people dies as long as my target dies. That's the thinking of a terrorist. Whether those collateral casualties are women or children or old people, it doesn't matter. The terrorist is blind. He wants to implement maximum damage. For him, the more the damage, the greater his victory. But this was not the case with Mumtaz Qadri. Mumtaz, when he was faced with those circumstances, took the action by shooting at the governor, but then when he had completed his act, he surrendered his weapon. There were people around the governor at the time. He did not target any single individual. All 25 bullets were aimed for the governor. They were not aimed for any other person, nor did any other person die as a result of this action. So, as with other terrorists, they indiscriminately kill. This was not a case of indiscriminate killing. There was one target in mind, and that target was shot at. Then when you look at the character of Shaheed Mumtaz, Ghazi Mumtaz Hussain Shaheed, you look, he has no criminal record. We're not dealing with someone who has a record of crime, or grime for that matter. We're looking at a person who has spent his life in the service of the state, a person of upright moral character, a person of integrity, a person who maintains a balance between his domestic life and his working life, a person who is an ideal citizen for all intents and purposes, a peaceful citizen, a person who doesn't engage with any kind of substance abuse that you could point towards and say, well, maybe out of substance abuse he was overwhelmed. Or a person who ever, even for that matter, advocated any form of killing. You don't have to be a terrorist, but you can be of a frame of mind where you say, well, killing is permissible in one form or the other. There are plenty of murderers on this earth who are not labeled as terrorists, but they commit murder and are tried for murder. Mumtaz Qadri was none of them. He was not one of those people who condoned any form of murder, let alone him himself, nor had he ever contemplated himself engaging with such an act. Nor was he indoctrinated. He wasn't an extremist. I've covered this point. But it's very important to remember, we are not dealing with an extremist. We are not dealing with someone who was indoctrinated or indoctrinated others to murder or to take life. We are dealing with a person whose motto in life was live and let live, love and be loved. We are dealing with a person who is an ideal citizen. And these things need to be brought about, because it's very easy to simply condemn him. One has to look at him and the circumstances that led to the events that unfolded. He had no family history of violence that could have been seen to be a precedent that he would follow. That yes, well, some people belong to family. There are families wherein murdering people or being violent is a norm. Mumtaz Qadri's family was a very respectable family, remains a very respectable family, a family that is not engaged or is known to be engaged in any form of violence, let alone murder. And therefore, he doesn't also have any violent association with any gangs or any other groups that subscribe, or political parties for that matter, that subscribe to murder. And there are plenty of parties in Pakistan that would resort to murder for their political motives. And finally, with respect to Mumtaz Qadri himself, rahimahullah ta'ala, he was not there to execute a fatwa. He was not acting in a set of circumstances where he found himself to be the person to enforce a given fatwa. For that matter, there was no competent authority at that time that had formally declared a fatwa. As with Salman Rushdie, the Iranian government, Khomeini had formally issued a fatwa. But in this instance, whilst individuals may have condemned the actions of the governor, no competent authority had at that juncture openly declared upon its citizens to go and enforce that any fatwa, notwithstanding the fact that it had been established by then that his remarks were not only controversial, but that his remarks were outside, had led him to the outside the fold of Islam. But despite that, Mumtaz Qadri wasn't there as an office bearer or executioner of any fatwa. The circumstances that led to the events are very important to be understood. But before we go into the actual day in question, let's look at the background. What actually led to all of this in the first place? What prompted this governor to make remarks in the manner that he made? Why would he go to such extents in making such remarks, which I'll talk about in a minute? Well, there was a woman by the name of Asiya Bibi, or now known as Asiya Masih. She had engaged in a skirmish with a certain individual, and in the course of her skirmish, she had uttered words of blasphemy. She was reported to the authorities. The authorities conducted an investigation, and therefore she was the subject of a prosecution. The session court found her guilty. She appealed to the High Court. The High Court found her guilty under 295C and of the Penal Code for blasphemy, and on that basis gave her a sentence to death. So she was convicted, duly convicted in a court of law. She appealed. The appeal was rejected, was refused, and so therefore she stood on death row. Of course, she had the right to appeal, which still stands now. But the reality is, at that juncture, she had been convicted, and that must be understood. She had been convicted in a court of law to have blasphemed against the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. What did the governor do? Salman Taseer, instead of understanding the sensitivity of the situation, he goes out on a full press conference and says, I'm going to get you a presidential pardon for what you've done. Don't worry about the fabric, don't worry about the conviction. I'm going to get you a pardon, which means that you're going to walk scot-free for what you've done. Don't worry about it. Forget the fact that you live in a country which is dominated by Muslims who feel offended that you have violated their law and you have violated their religious values. You have hurt millions of people by what you have done. But to hell with those people, I'm going to get a presidential pardon. He took it upon himself to get this presidential pardon. But in the process of getting that presidential pardon, he uttered statements that constituted blasphemy under 295C. For example, he referred to the 295C as, and I'll translate this in English, as Kala Kanun, a black law. He said this has got nothing to do with the Quran and Sunnah. This has got nothing to do with religion. With respect, Salman Taseer is a jahil. He has no qualifications in the Quran and Sunnah. He was not entitled to say that 295C has not got nothing to do with the Quran and Sunnah. If he had had it from a competent authority that 295C is disjunctive from the Quran and Sunnah, he could have advertised that view. But he took it upon himself to be a mufti, and he then condemned the ulama by saying, what do they know? This is not a religious issue. Salman Taseer was an illiterate person in the Quran and Sunnah, and therefore he made these I would say not negligent, not reckless, but these malicious remarks against verses of the Quran and Sunnah. He directly offended the Quran and Sunnah by saying that this is a kala kanun. But then not only did he stop at that, he then went on further by saying that this punishment, i.e. death, which is a prescription which is entrenched in the Quran and Sunnah, he then goes on to say this is a zalimana saza. This is a cruel punishment. He then goes on to say this is against insaniyat. Insaniyat ke khilaf hai. Who is he to stand up and define the parameters of what insaniyat is and what zulm is? The Quran and Sunnah know better than Salman Taseer. And if he felt that this was a violation of the Quran and Sunnah, it was for him to adduce expert evidence by those who are professed with knowledge of the Quran and Sunnah to say that 295C is in contravention of Quran and Sunnah, and he could have mounted a campaign in a very civilized way. But the barbarity with which he went about trying to indiscriminately defend this woman from the punishment that she had been pronounced in a court of law, he was not willing to stop at anything. He even in that process blasphemed himself against the very law that was the subject of condemnation of Asiya in the first place. So not only does he aid a blasphemer, a convicted criminal, he uses his position as governor to aid a convicted criminal. Please note these words. He aids a convicted criminal to get her a presidential pardon. But then in the process of getting that, he then exacerbates and aggravates the situation by making comments on the public forum about the law itself and about the nature of punishment. He had no locus standi to do that. He had no basis to do that, but he did it. And then not only that, when people began to protest, they lodged an FIR. In Pakistan, if you have a problem or if you want to report a criminal offence, you lodge what we call an FIR. FIR itself is not evidence, but it's just a report. It's a first incident report, basically. So when the people went to report the FIR, they were told by the officer in charge, sorry, you can't lodge an FIR against the governor. He is immune to this. He is immune to this. So they go and lodge a writ in the Rawalpindi court, and the writ is dismissed. Why? Because you cannot prosecute a governor. This is the state of Pakistan. I must say, in this respect, the civilization of Europe is something that Pakistan needs to learn a lesson from. Here, no one is above the law. Everyone is accountable to the courts. Everyone is accountable to law. But here, Salman Taseer found himself in a position where he has immunity from being prosecuted. He openly breaks the law, and when people want to seek a redress to their grievances in a legitimate manner, they are stopped from doing so, both at the level of prosecution and at judicial level. So what do you expect people to do? When the door of the police station is closed to them, when the door of the court is closed to them, and then to add insult to injury, he doesn't stop, he carries on with his press conferences. He's phoning his contacts in the media that, listen, I need you to support me on this. He doesn't rest on it. He's made it his campaign to go out of his way, not only in aiding a convicted criminal by using his position as governor, but then by condemning a law. And may I remind you that when he took oath as a governor, one of his terms of his oath were that he would defend one of his oaths as governor, as part of the oath that he took, was that he would defend the Islamic ideology. So he was in direct breach of his own oath. A man who supports a convicted criminal breaches his own oath. The doors of the police station are closed to the public. The doors of the courts are closed to the public. If there's not going to be agitation, then what else does one expect? Did the Pakistan government really think that the millions of citizens who have been hurt by both Asia Bibi and her comments, and then by Salman Taseer, would sit behind closed doors and have intellectual discussions? Of course there would be public outrage. But the reality is the government was negligent and did nothing in this respect. He didn't even stand down as governor. He carried on his long march to try to find this so-called justice for this convicted criminal. But then he didn't stop at that. Forget what he said in public. In private, Ghazi Mumtaz and his colleagues testified to this. In private, Ghazi asked him, the governor, he said, "Sir, you've made these comments in public. There's a lot of turmoil. There's a lot of unrest in the public. Do something about it. Calm things down." And what does he respond? His response at that juncture, privately to Mumtaz Qadri and those around, because there were other guards around, was so further blasphemous, was so obnoxious, that it was at that juncture that this individual no longer could contain himself and therefore planted 25 bullets in his body. It was at that juncture. Those comments had been made before. The agitation in the public was there. But there was no suggestion that Mumtaz Qadri should carry out this in a premeditated way. It was when he made those private comments. So if you can imagine, a person would go to such lengths in making openly blasphemous comments in public, you can imagine the nature of comments he would make privately. And when he made those comments in private to Mumtaz Qadri, the result was that Mumtaz Qadri could no longer contain himself. He took up his arm and planted those bullets in the body of the governor. And for your information, those guards who were around at the time, they had heard those comments, they had heard those remarks, and they too were so devastated that when Mumtaz Qadri fired, they did not fire in retaliation against Mumtaz Qadri, because they could sympathize with the sentiments of Mumtaz at that juncture in time. And so therefore, this isn't a case of cold-blooded murder as the Western media would like to portray it in its campaign against religion, or specifically Islam. This wasn't a case of terrorism. This was a case of a person being provoked to a certain degree, beyond a certain degree, where he no longer was able to control himself the way others had managed to control themselves. He was forced to that position. Then when we come on to looking at the trial itself, the matter started off with Ghazi Mumtaz Hussain Shaheed being tried under two separate auspices. Number one, 302, which is standard murder, 302, and number two, under terrorism charges. When it got to the High Court dismissed the terrorism charge and allowed for the 302 murder to remain. This was what the judicial process entailed. But before I go into the judicial process, I'd like to say something. That the judicial process, I mean, we always knew, and you don't need to ask me, Amnesty International and its record will give you plenty of ammunition, that Pakistan is one of the worst countries when it comes to human rights violations. Pakistan has a corrupt system, everyone knows that. Everyone, from top to bottom, is bent in their own way. They will sell whatever they need to sell for their agenda. They will barter their iman if they need to. So the lack of independence of the judiciary or of the state arms was a known thing. But in this case, rather than enforcing the independence of the judiciary and giving him a fair trial, the whole process was tainted by material irregularity and procedural impropriety. And let me give you examples of this. Procedural improprieties. And of course, those who were defense counsels, who were retired chief justices, will bear witness to this in their own testimonies, that the defense wasn't given a proper opportunity to elaborate upon its arguments. It was as though the judges had made up their mind. All they wanted to do was, for the sake of formality, allow them a very limited window to present their arguments. And then when their arguments were presented, the judgments that ensued made no or very little reference to the arguments of the defense. It was like a show trial. It was like a formality. The decision had been made. So there, the prosecution's arguments, on the other hand, were openly referred to in the judgments and were given great credence to. And if you read the transcripts of the judgments, it would be very, very clear as to the emphasis with which arguments of the prosecution were highlighted and arguments of the defense were simply dismissed without proper reasoning. Then you look at the other element of procedural impropriety. The higher court is there to listen to an appeal. The appeal from the high court had dismissed the terrorism charge. The matter was appealed to the Supreme Court. If they felt that the lower court had erred in dismissing the terrorism charge, it was for them to redirect the matter back to the lower court and say that you should address the issue of terrorism. But no, the Supreme Court took it upon itself to instate within the prosecution bundle the terrorism charge. So 302 was there, but they took it upon themselves. It is very unprecedented for the Supreme Court to behave like this. The reality is they wanted to stick in the terrorism charge because it would have given more credence to their ultimate ambitions, which of course manifested themselves a week or so ago. So then when we look at the material irregularity, any civilized court in any civilized country looks at the offense and the circumstances of the offense. When you look at Mumtaz Qadri, when you look at the circumstances, that there was no premeditated murder, it was circumstantial, why was not the defense of provocation allowed? After all, Pakistani law understands, and by the way, Pakistani law was formed under the shadow of English law. Pakistani law and its whole framework was almost a copy and paste of English law. Provocation exists as a defense to murder. Why wasn't provocation given due regard? After all, you are dealing with a man whose love for his Prophet is more than the love for his parents, more than love for his family. That's what the threshold of Iman is. لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى أكون أحب إليه من والده وولده والناس أجمعين. That is the threshold of love for every real mu'min. Ghazi Mumtaz was no different. For him, the love of his Prophet was paramount, was absolute. And so therefore, when he was provoked by the public statements, and then more specifically by those private statements, why didn't the court of law take that into account? If not at all, if not for anything else, at least from the perspective of sentencing. It did not give proper regard. That was a material irregularity. Then after that, you have other defenses to murder. Even English law recognizes other defenses to murder. And I don't mean things like insanity, because Ghazi Mumtaz did not, even till his last moment, ever suggest that there was any element of insanity in his actions. The reality was that the law recognizes that sometimes a person can commit murder and be, at that juncture, be the subject of what English law refers to as diminished responsibility. Diminished responsibility is a defense to a charge of murder. And if it is successful, the trial judge can allow the defendant to walk. But there was no regard at all to the concept of diminished responsibility. What is diminished responsibility? In England, it was very famous, and has been and continues to be famous, where you have a woman who is, for example, a woman who is constantly overwhelmed by the mental and physical torture by her partner or husband, and in that process goes out and loses control at a certain juncture and murders him. And innumerable women in England and Wales have successfully defended murder charges on the defense of diminished responsibility. Diminished responsibility accepts that whilst you are normal, whilst you are sane, but because of the pressures that have been mounted upon you, generally and more specifically at the material time of the murder, the trial judge will take that into account for sure. Why was not diminished responsibility part of the fabric of Mumtaz Qadri Shaheed marhum's trial? Because quite simply, the judicial authorities were not interested in giving him justice. By understanding the nature of the action, they were simply hell-bent upon endorsing and rubber stamping a direction that had been made from up above. The very direction that threatened every TV channel and every newspaper that don't you dare broadcast anything about Mumtaz Qadri, lest your license would be revoked, lest you will be subjected to proceedings by your regulator. That very force that closed the media, the so-called free media down, that same force ensured that the judicial process meant that there were procedural improprieties and material irregularities in the trial of Mumtaz Qadri rahimahumullahu ta'ala. And the fascinating thing is, Asia's case is still pending, yet it predates Mumtaz Qadri's case. And there are many, and up till now, no one has been executed under 295C. No one has been executed. And by the way, for those who say, well, how do you know that he had committed blasphemy in the first place? In the pleadings, in the trial of Ghazi Mumtaz Hussain, it was impliedly accepted by the prosecution that Salman Taseer committed blasphemy, as a result of which this action ensued, that he was assassinated. So in the pleadings they impliedly conceded that there was a blasphemy that was the cause of the assassination in itself. So therefore, Asia's case is still pending. This is the kind of justice system that we are dealing with. A justice system that applies, we thought, to the rich and doesn't apply to the poor. Now, history has shown us that this justice, this perverse justice system, applies only to religious people. And as far as those people who are part of the secular arm are concerned, if their name is Raymond Allen Davis, they murder 2 people in cold blood, and those who come to rescue them murder someone by knocking them over, and they walk out of Pakistan scot-free. Where is the justice in Pakistan and its system. Pakistan was always crippled with corruption, but today we have realized that that corruption wasn't internal. It wasn't just the product of those thieves and those bandits who are hell-bent on robbing Pakistan from the integrity that its leader Quaid-e-Azam wanted for it. But today this case has showed us that external forces have so much influence in Pakistan that they can prosecute, they can charge, prosecute, charge, convict, execute a person who has no standing, an individual who was forced under circumstances to do what he did, under diminished responsibility, who was provoked. But the same system, shame on it, if Muhammad Ali Jinnah was alive today, he would spit at the Supreme Court and say, how dare you execute one person because he has no one behind him, and allow Raymond Davis to walk out of Pakistan with a smirk on his face and say, what can you do? I have bought the system and I have paid my way out of your country to show you your justice applies to those who are weak and meek. I have a government behind me. I am part of the CIA. Your laws do not apply to me. Pakistan and its authorities protested. He has no immunity, he has no immunity. And the CIA and America said, whatever, and they brought their guy back home. He's safe and sound, having committed 3 murders. Is this justice? Is this the kind of justice that Pakistan wants to show that it is dispensing? We thought it was only justice for the rich, but today we have found that Pakistan as an institution, whether that's its judicial or executive or legislative institution, has a clear prejudice to dispense justice also to those secular liberals whose methodology is fascist in nature, who want to suppress religion from Pakistan. Why? They want to show religion to be barbaric. And they will do everything to show that this was an act of aggression and terrorism. But history will testify that we stand up for Mumtaz Qadri because he was an individual who was provoked, suffered from diminished responsibility, and was not given justice by his own state, by his own judicial system. Had justice been dispensed, Ghazi Mumtaz would be on the roads today, having successfully pleaded the defense of diminished responsibility. And for those hypocritic politicians who say that don't call him Shaheed because he was convicted in a court of law, well then I suggest you go and shut down the PPP, the Pakistan Political Party. Why? Because everyone in the PPP calls Zulfikar Ali Bhutto as a Shaheed, but he was also convicted by a court of law. He was also executed by due process. If no one can question the PPP in calling Zulfikar Ali Bhutto as Shaheed, then no one can question the Ahl Sunnah for calling Ghazi Mumtaz Hussain Qadri as Shaheed. He was a Shaheed and will always remain a Shaheed because he was the subject of oppression and subjection by the judicial system and the political system of his own country. It is with great sadness I relay this message to you. When you go back and discuss this with your colleagues, make sure you emphasize that this is not a case of terrorism as the media would like to have it portrayed. This is not a case of premeditated murder. This is an individual who was so engrossed in his civility, in his normality, in his respectability, which was the product of his love for his Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. But when he was provoked, and provoked to the extent that words were used that he couldn't tolerate. And if you look at the way, Mumtaz Qadri is a trained commando. He's a trained killer. All he needs to do is put one bullet in the governor and he would know that that would finish him off. The very fact that he put 25 bullets through the governor shows his state of mind. A person who is a commando, who can take one shot and kill on the spot, does not do so. He takes 25 shots to kill him. What does that tell you about his state of mind? He was provoked. He had suffered from diminished responsibility on account of the negligent, reckless, and above all, malicious actions of the mal'oon Salman Taseer. May Allah allow us to know the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And allow us to raise our heads high in supporting Ghazi Mumtaz Hussain Shaheed, knowing that he was a victim of the Pakistani judicial and political system that denied him justice. May Allah allow justice to prevail in the whole world and allow us to understand the reality of this case. وَمَا عَلَيْنَا إِلَّا الْبَلَاغُ الْمُبِينَ. Are there any questions? There have been very few occasions in the history of Pakistan where all the schools of thought have been united, whether that's the Shia, the Wahhabi religion, or any other religion that calls, or sect that calls itself Muslim in Pakistan. Very rarely have they all been united. And on this occasion, the entire geography of Pakistan bears witness that every school of thought agrees on the blasphemic nature of remarks made by Salman Taseer, number one, and number two, agrees that the death penalty given to Ghazi was wrong. There are two facets of agreement. There is no one who has mounted an opposition to this question. That's a question which a lot of people have asked. You see, the point is that Islam, or the fabric of the Quran and Sunnah, does not authorize or does not recommend that a particular sentence is executed by a civilian, an individual. There is no requirement for or obligation upon someone to, if someone gives a fatwa, for example, no one is obliged to implement that, as in take the law in their own hands. But, here's the but, if a person finds himself overwhelmed in a situation and then goes and commits an offense, that offense cannot be taken in its extremity like murder. You will look at defenses such as provocation, such as diminished responsibility. That's the point I'm trying to make. What the ulama weren't suggesting was that go and kill him. Salman Rushdie, he still lives up till this day. You know, the reality is, I don't know if he did come in public what people would do, but the reality is he's still alive. No one is there to enforce that fatwa, as in to kill him by official protocol. But if someone finds themselves in a situation where they encounter him, then if they commit that act, you will look at that act in light of the circumstances. You won't just put a blanket over it and say, well, that was murder. So whilst the state does not, Islamic State does not authorize or does not allow its civilians to execute sentences, if a person does, it will look at it in a very different way to the standard criminal offense. You referred back to the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Well, there are many examples where there were people who blasphemed against the Prophet ﷺ. I can give you examples both in the time of the Prophet ﷺ and even after his time, where people blasphemed against the Prophet ﷺ, and those individuals who had heard that blasphemy then lost control and they killed such people. And when they killed such people, they were brought to the Prophet ﷺ, who did not reprimand them as you would reprimand a normal criminal. I can cite two examples by way of example. Once during the time of the Prophet ﷺ and once after his time. And I only give these two, there are many more. Once during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, a woman was found murdered in her home. The Prophet ﷺ announced, will the murderer declare, it's a long hadith, I don't want to go into the detail of the hadith, will the person who murdered confess, will he bring himself forward? To which an elderly gentleman came forward and he confessed to murdering this woman. The Prophet ﷺ asked, why did you do what you did? He said, Ya Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I tolerated her in every aspect of life, but when she blasphemed against you, I lost control. I couldn't control my iman, and the ghairat of my iman overtook me. I could not take it anymore. I therefore struck her, and that blow resulted in her death. The Prophet ﷺ did not require qisas on that occasion. He did not try the person. An example, after the Prophet ﷺ's time, in the time of Sayyidina Umar, a certain priest was in a Christian priest was in a church, and so some children were playing with sticks and a ball, almost like hockey, and they were playing, and the ball fell into the monastery, and the priest got so annoyed. But when the children came and said, please sir, can we have the ball, he was so angry, he said, no, I'm not going to give you the ball. So as children, they said, look, please give it to us, like we say, give it to us for the wasta of the Prophet ﷺ. Give it to us in the name of Muhammad ﷺ. Because as children, they thought, well, if we give wasta of someone who we love and who's senior, maybe he'll give it. At that age, they didn't appreciate that this person and his thinking is adverse. When he heard the wasta of the Prophet ﷺ, he actually slandered the Prophet ﷺ at that time. Those children were so overwhelmed, were so taken back by what he said, that they struck him with their sticks. And such was the nature of their strike that one blow resulted in his death. Again, when the matter was presented to Sayyidina Umar radiyallahu an, when the matter was presented to Sayyidina Umar, he did not engage those children in due process, because the blasphemy itself was a cause, or was an operative cause that provoked his murder in the first place. Then your question is, well, why didn't the Prophet ﷺ authorize the murder of those Meccans and Munafiqs? Well, as far as the Meccans are concerned, those Meccans who used to persecute the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ didn't have an apparatus, and it wasn't the Prophet ﷺ's methodology to simply kill his opposition like this, because he wanted to give them da'wah. But when there was state apparatus in place, i.e. in Medina Munawwara, and then if someone blasphemed, the Prophet ﷺ didn't mind criticism. But if someone blasphemed, then there is an instance of a Jew who was renowned for blaspheming against the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ himself commissioned and sanctioned that this person should be put to death. The reality is, then why didn't he do the same for Abdullah ibn Ubay or the others? There were other reasons behind that. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ did not want to give the impression to people outside that he kills his, because they used to represent themselves as companions. So he did not want to give the impression to people outside that Muhammad kills his, so they would have done propaganda that Muhammad kills his companions, number one. Number two, the Prophet ﷺ, because of his patience with them, and they didn't used to blaspheme. These munafiqs didn't used to blaspheme against the Prophet. They were munafiqs, but they didn't used to blaspheme. But the Prophet ﷺ's patience, despite knowing their nifaq, was because he had hoped that they would find their ways, and as a result, some of them found their ways. Some of them didn't. If they didn't, their families did. But because of the perseverance of the Prophet ﷺ, there were a lot of people who converted to Islam. So what I'm trying to say is that those munafiqs didn't openly blaspheme. Whatever they did behind closed doors. But when you blaspheme in the public domain, you are making a point. You are making a statement. You see, if Salman Taseer would have made the statements that he made in closed doors, and then processed his his ambitions through legal protocol, he probably would be alive today. But for the life of me, I don't know what possessed, that specimen for going out. It was arrogance. It was pride. So what are you going to do about it? The way, if you look at his YouTube videos, what are you going to do about it? I'm going to get her a pardon. His arrogance on his face was so palpable that I'm going to get her a pardon. It was as if the decision had already been made. I will get her a pardon. She will get a pardon. The reality was there was sheer arrogance. When you are dealing with emotions of people, you have to be sensitive anyway. And the greatest emotions of Muslims ultimately culminates in their relationship to Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so therefore he was negligent in the minimum, reckless in the middle, and malicious if you look at it in the very extreme.
Any other questions?
Yes.
I think people are very confused. Just brief us on the status, the Iman of Shaheed Ghazi. We read that he saw Prophet in a wakeful state.
If Ghazi has claimed that he saw the Prophet ﷺ, then this is not a claim that he is the first one to make in history. There are many others who have made similar claims, who have been in similar circumstances. So it's not ba'id, it's not something that is beyond intellectual understanding of those who understand the Quran and Sunnah to accept the concept of the Prophet ﷺ showing himself to Ghazi in what we call Jism Amsali. And in your tasawwuf you would have known what Jism Amsali is. So for the Prophet ﷺ to appear in front of Ghazi in Jism Amsali is frankly not unprecedented. There are many who have seen the Prophet ﷺ in that form. Whether Ghazi himself saw or not, well, we only have his testimony to look at. And if you look at his track record, Ghazi may be whatever the West wants to call, but he's not a liar. Whatever he said, he said. He stands by what he said, he stands by what he did. His testimony was one of integrity. And a person who is on death row would be foolish to lie. And Ghazi was a person of forthrightness and integrity, and there's no reason why he should concoct such a claim. The reality is, if he said he saw the Prophet ﷺ, we believe him, and we believe that the Prophet ﷺ would more than likely have come to him for what he had done. Yes.
Should the courts of Salman Taseer, should they have approached him to make a public tawbah?
Salman Taseer. Should the courts have? He'd closed the courts down. Forget about opening the doors to the public. Him and those who were with him, they had gagged the court. So forget about holding him to account and get him to do tawbah. The door was closed. It was like, bugger off. You don't have any remedy.
The Sharia rule is the Sharia ruling that if someone blasphemes, that they have to make public tawbah line.
Yeah. And
also, I was just wondering
but the thing is that you have to realize, I'm sorry, this is a legal point for those of you who are lawyers will understand. 295C is a strict liability offense. It's not an offense where you look at intention. You know, it's not like, it's like you go up to someone and say, oh, kutia. No, I'm saying it very nicely, and my intention is, kutia, you know, when you use offensive words, it is imputed that you mean only those words. Sorry, I had to give you that example just to wake you up, because you were all like this. But the reality is, when you use a certain terminology, it's like a person saying to his wife, I divorce you, and then says, no, I didn't intend divorce, you know, it was just a romantic spree. For goodness sake, I mean, I've never known a romantic spree to involve a term divorce. When you use the word divorce, you mean divorce and nothing else. Whether you say it in Swahili, Chinese, Japanese, English, Arabic, divorce is divorce. So when you use certain words, it is imputed that you intend the natural and probable meaning of those words. Now, the offense is a strict liability offense. And strict liability means intention is irrelevant. If you have used those words, then you are culpable. Of course, you can put in your defense to the trial judge and say, look, I know it's a strict liability offense, but look, these are my mitigation. This is my mitigation. I didn't intend this. The judge can take that into account when he's sentencing. But the reality is 295C is a strict liability offense.
Sorry, one more. Do you think Mumtaz Qadri should have served time if it all went properly, like he should have? For what he did, would you think he should have walked free? Or
well, the reality is, when you apply the defense of provocation and diminished responsibility, I don't need to go as far as Pakistan. There are women who have murdered their partners, husbands, and walked out of court scot-free. Why? It's because the system recognizes the defense of provocation and diminished responsibility. Why was Ghazi not afforded this courtesy? Why? Why was the judicial authorities hell-bent on simply going through a process almost like a rubber stamping a process without giving due regard to the individual circumstances? Those private comments, they're not available in the public domain. The trial advocate, I don't know his name, the trial advocate Nazir Akhtar, and there was another one, both of them were retired judges who actually were trial advocates for Mumtaz Shaheed. Both of them categorically said that those statements that Salman Taseer made at that juncture was so bad, he said, I can't even bring them to my mouth. Oh, has he?
Yeah.
Thank you.
And they are quite, it's quite
For the record, I don't know that. I haven't heard that speech. What?
It's basically, Allama Khadim said that Salman Taseer said to Ghazi Mumtaz Hussain that in order to fatwa mein apni chuti ke no karega.
No, there was something else also.
That he said on the media.
He said that in the media.
No, he actually said not only black, it's SHIT in English.
There you are.
What parallel is there between this and the Charlie Hebdo?
Sorry?
What parallel is between this case and the Charlie Hebdo case that happened?
The parallels between this and the Charlie Hebdo case.
Well, Charlie Hebdo case is a case that they had committed naturally blasphemy, but the reality is that the Al-Qaeda, we do not subscribe to ISIS or Al-Qaeda in carrying out what they did. Their actions were premeditated. They were pursuant to their agenda. They weren't interested in Gustakhi Rasul. They were interested in their agenda. They're murderers. They're butchers, full stop. They weren't there to protect the sanctity of the Prophet ﷺ. If that was the case, where were they at the time of Salman Rushdie? Where were they at the time of Salman Taseer? You know, if they want to do something in Pakistan, they can do it. It's very easy for them. But why don't they do it? They found it was politically in their interest to do what they did with Charlie Hebdo. It had nothing to do with the Prophet ﷺ. It was part of their own political agenda. And so therefore they were accountable in their own right. That was an act of terrorism, because this concept of indiscriminate casualties or collateral casualties is not part, and you cannot plead diminished responsibility or provocation. Oh, I just killed that old woman because, I thought, may as well. Or I killed that child because, he was there also. So that's not a defense of provocation. That's not a defense of diminished responsibility. It's that this person antagonized me, this person provoked me, this person made me subject to what I was. I attacked him, not that I attacked 20 other people in the thing. So if ISIS were sincere in their ambitions for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they would have only targeted those people who were directly responsible. Why did they kill innocent civilians? That is not Islam. And because that is not Islam, it brings into question their intentions. ISIS are not Muslims. Al-Qaeda are kafirs. The reality is that people need to understand that these terrorist organizations have got nothing to do with Islam. They are out of the fold of Islam. To call them Muslim brings your own iman into disrepute. To call Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Daesh or whatever they call them, I could use a few French words here, whatever they call themselves, to even call them Muslims brings your own iman into disrepute. Yeah. So be careful. This is a matter of ilmul kalam. The Quran and Sunnah does not oblige civilians in the presence of a state to execute. Okay? Whether it's a Muslim or a non-Muslim. It's not the job of the individual to execute a sentence. Everyone is entitled to due process. That's why when Salman Taseer made his comments, the people quite rightly, they went and reported to the police. The police station closed its doors to them. Then they went to the court. The court closed its door to them. That's the proper way. But even the fatwas that were issued at the time, they didn't call for members of the public that, please, members of the public, go and kill him. No. That's not the job. But if someone finds themselves in that position, with those circumstances, you have to look at those circumstances when you try that person. You can't simply say, well, he's a murderer. Or like the Supreme Court says, well, it'll be easy if we label him as a terrorist. I mean, how perverse is that? A Supreme Court brings in a charge which has been dropped by a lower court. The proper way to do it is that the Supreme Court should have gone back to the High Court and said, retry him on terrorism charge. But no, the Supreme Court is acting like Fir'aun and saying, well, we will do what we want to do. Yes. No, please, no problem.
So sensitive topic as well. The other thing is that I don't know about the facts, the appeals that the case trial in a court as well. If we consider that he said something in privately, and so the other witness should give their witness, but I don't know whether this is on the record.
They did. They did.
Then it is.
And they didn't fire. There were other guards there. When Ghazi fired on Maloon Taseer, they didn't fire back on Ghazi.
No. This at that time they didn't have any, because I follow the at that time 4 years ago all the things
Sure.
on the TV. There wasn't conversation between them at that time. That's private conversation. If before that even, there should be the witnesses, and if they're the witnesses, they should record their evidence
they did.
in a case.
They did.
But I didn't know about
No, those other guards
But I
did,
could
absolutely.
find it later on.
I don't know his name. His name was Asif or something. It was another one. There was one particular name of an individual, but there were other. No, that's a very good question. You see, there's two kind of words. There's what you call sari and kinaya. Sari words are express words, and kinaya are words which are implied words. If a word has been used, for example, taking your example, It's a good example. A person say the Prophet ﷺ was poor. Now, if a third person listening to this considers this to be blasphemy, his job is to bring it into a court of law and say, I want this person to explain. Okay? Now the judge would say to him, what did you mean by poor? There his intention will be asked. And he could say, my intention there wasn't to disrespect the Prophet ﷺ, it was to describe his state in which he lived. Because the reality is, he didn't live like a rich man. He lived the life like poor people lived. But therefore you will ask his intention, because the word itself is not controversial. If you call someone poor, that's not a swear. But it can be a swear by saying, if you intend you're a poor person. Why you're a poor person? It all depends on the author. But where you use words which are sari, which are explicit, and they have a clear meaning, it's like, I think the example I gave, you go up to someone and say, how are you, dog? Now, you say, no, my intention was in pursuance of friendship. Now, if he understands that friendship, that's fine, depending where, of course, you use that word. But if he doesn't understand that, then he will hold you to account, because when you call someone a dog, a third person can assume that by default, when you label a human as a dog, that you're swearing at him. So, it depends on the word that you use. For example, if Salman Taseer had said, this law, and this is what those who justify him say later, they say, he wasn't against Namus Risalat, and in fact Salman Taseer himself, he says, I'm not against Namus Risalat. How can I be against Namus Risalat? What he was trying to say, and what those who were his people who were trying to justify him, what they were trying to say was that, look, it's the way the law has been used, it's been manipulated by people. That's what we're against. Now, that's all he needed to say. He could have said in public, look, this law is being abused by people, therefore I want to bring into place certain procedural frameworks that ensures that this law isn't abused. Now that's fair, isn't it? No one would have a problem with him. But for him to say, it's a black law, it's it's a zalimana saza, it's against insaniyat, nauz billah, nakle kufr kufr nabashad. So when you use that kind of terminology, that terminology by default is blasphemic, is offensive. If I go up to someone and say, your statement was a black statement, I clearly can't intend kindness with that statement. So what I'm trying to say is that you have to look at the statement. Was it a statement where ta'wil could be done? Ta'wil means interpretation. Or was it a statement which by default is offensive? And if by default it's offensive, then intention is irrelevant. Like I gave you the example of divorce. If a person says to his wife, I divorce you, by default, the assumption is that he means divorce and not a candlelit dinner. Yes. All right, one last one. What is the? Anyone who says or does an act or a statement, anyone who says a statement or does an act that constitutes disrespect, blatant disrespect and offense to the Prophet ﷺ. Disagreeing with him is not something that in 1400 years people have disagreed. No problem. It's when you level insult and offense, that's different. You see? That is the key difference between...
If you're a Muslim and then you disagree.
Sorry?
What if you're a Muslim and then you disagree?
If you're a Muslim and disagree with the Prophet ﷺ, you lose your iman. Because you must accept the Prophet ﷺ's word as the final word and as him being the final arbitrator. The Quran says, فَلَا وَرَبِّكَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ حَتَّى يُحَكِّمُوكَ. You cannot be a true believer. You cannot be a believer if you do not accept the Prophet ﷺ to be the final arbitrator amongst you. Yes.
Is it because he wasn't offered the option, the manslaughter, diminished responsibility? Is that the reason why he's classed as Shaheed?
Well, he's classed as Shaheed because he's a victim of a system which did not give him justice.
Right.
Any person who has not been given justice and is wrongly hung, wrongly executed, is a Shaheed. You know, like the PPP say Zulfikar Ali Bhutto is Shaheed because he was wrongly convicted, wrongly, processed.
Last question at the front. Do you have a question?
In your opinion, will the case of Shaheed Mumtaz Hussain or Pakistani politicians do the way they do things, or will it be something swept under the carpet?
Pakistani politicians, and this is my personal view, and I don't mind sharing it in the public domain, are some of the most bent people in the world. And this is not a joke. I have never known in my life, I've interacted with different nationalities. You can call it a racist comment, but some of the politicians that I've seen in Pakistan, they are inherently bent. They would sell their children if they had to. They are people who have lost, forget about Iman, who have lost values of insaniyat, of humanity. We are easy to criticize, people in African countries and say, well, they're not civilized. But these people are so-called civilized people, but they behave worse than animals if you look at their own lifestyles. It's very sad for me to say that because naturally, Pakistan was made on the pillar of La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. But someone once said to me that all the politicians are thieves in Pakistan, and I said, no, all the politicians are not thieves, all the thieves are politicians. Yeah. It's very sad. It's very difficult to find an honest broker. It's very, very difficult to find an honest broker. They think by default when you come into politics, lying, corruption and these things, these are part and parcel of the game. And a state which is headed by people who can't even read Qul Huwallahu Ahad properly. And what does that tell you about the Islamic nature of that state? اللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد معظم الجود والكرم وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم وصل عليه اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه اللهم أرنا حقائق الأشياء كما هي توفنا مسلمين الہی ہماری اس کاوش و کوشش کو اپنی بارگاہ میں قبول و منظور فرما جن سمے میں ہم نے تیرے اور تیرے محبوب کے دین کا تذکرہ تفکر و تدبر کیا ہے اس کو شرف قبولیت عطا فرما اس کے صدقے میں ہمارے قلوب و اذہان کو ایمان ایقان اور عرفان کی دولت عطا فرما الہ العالمین دنیا اور عقبہ میں ہمیں عزت و آبرو عطا فرما غیرت ایمان عطا فرما عشق و محبت مصطفیٰ صلی اللہ علیہ وآلہ وسلم اور ان کے تقاضوں کو پورا کرنے کی توفیق عطا فرما الہ العالمین ہمیں دنیا اور عقبہ میں ان کی غلامی کا توق عطا فرما وصلی اللہ علی حبیبہ سیدنا سندنا مولانا مرشدنا محمد وآلہ وصحبہ اجمعین برحمتک یا ارحم الراحمین.